Welcome back to Old State Valuable Coins. In today's exciting video, we're exploring the top 4 most valuable and expensive United States wheat pennies. Old coins that may look ordinary at first glance, but can become highly desirable because of rarity, condition, minting varieties, and historical importance. From wartime America to the early Cold War era, each of these Lincoln wheat cents has a fascinating story to tell. So stay with us until the end, because you might be surprised to discover just how valuable some of these tiny old pennies can become. Let's get started. First up imagine a 1-cent coin leaving the Denver Mint in 1951, entering circulation at a moment when America was no longer living in the shadow of World War II, but was already facing a new international crisis that would shape the next generation. The coin you are looking at is the 1951 D. Lincoln wheat cent, identified by the small D mint mark beneath the date. More than 7 decades later, it may look like an ordinary old penny, especially if it has scratches, dark toning, or heavy signs of circulation, but the world into which this coin was born was anything but ordinary. In 1951, Harry S. Truman was president, the Korean War was raging, the Cold War was becoming increasingly dangerous, and Americans were watching the balance between military security and economic stability with growing concern. The Korean conflict had begun in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed into South Korea, and by 1951 the fighting had become a brutal struggle involving United Nations forces, with the United States playing a major military role. The conflict had also created economic pressure at home. Defense spending was increasing, strategic materials were being redirected toward national security, and fears of another global conflict were influencing government decisions and public behavior. At the same time, America was experiencing the remarkable prosperity that had emerged from the industrial transformation of the 1940s. Wartime production had created enormous manufacturing capacity, and many American families were now entering an era of rising wages, expanding homeownership, growing automobile ownership, and increasing consumer demand. But prosperity did not mean economic calm. Inflation had become a serious problem. By early 1951, consumer prices were rising rapidly, and the Federal Reserve was struggling with the question of how to control inflation while the Treasury Department wanted to keep government borrowing costs low. The dispute culminated in the famous Treasury-Federal Reserve Accord of March 1951, which restored greater independence to the Federal Reserve in monetary policy. Even something as small as a 1-cent coin was therefore part of a much larger economic system. The 1951 D was not created to commemorate the Korean War or to become a future rarity. It was manufactured because Americans still needed pennies for everyday commerce. A child could receive one as an allowance, a customer could use it to complete a purchase, or a shopkeeper could place it into a cash drawer as part of a day's business. The coin was ordinary money at the time, yet the historical circumstances surrounding its birth make it a remarkable survivor of early Cold War America. So how many 1951 D wheat pennies are believed to exist today, and what might one actually be worth? The most useful answer comes from combining the estimated survival data with the realities of the market. PCGS estimates roughly 62 million 1951 D cents surviving across all grades, around 8,400 at MS60 or better, and about 4,200 at MS65 or better. Those figures should not be treated as an exact count of unique coins because survival estimates are based on expert analysis of population reports, auction appearances, and other information. They include raw and certified coins and are intended as estimates rather than a complete census. For an ordinary circulated 1951 D, the monetary value can be modest, often ranging from only a few cents to perhaps a few tens of cents depending upon where, color, originality, and the current collector market. Better preserved circulated examples can command more, while about uncirculated pieces may enter the dollar range. Lower mint state coins may be worth several dollars or more, and attractive red examples in higher grades can rise into the tens or hundreds of dollars. Once we approach the finest certified population, however, the market can change dramatically. The documented $8,100 auction result for an MS68 RD example demonstrates how far an exceptional coin can move beyond the value of an ordinary survivor. There are also recognized varieties that can produce their own premiums. For instance, Piece GS records a $796 auction result for a 1951 DFS 512 over Mintmark example graded MS66 plus RD. Although that particular result should be understood as a historical sale rather than a guaranteed current value. A 1951 D/D repunched Mintmark example has also appeared in the market at significantly higher prices than a normal circulated coin, depending on grade and certification. These numbers show why it is dangerous to give one blanket value for every 1951 D penny. The difference between a scratched brown coin found in pocket change and a superb red MS68 example can be enormous. Even within the same grade, appeal, color, strike, surface quality, certification, and market timing can influence the final price. The finest known category is also not permanently fixed because new discoveries and new submissions can change population reports. So the most accurate way to describe the top end is to say that extraordinary certified examples have reached thousands of dollars, with the current documented auction record at $8,100, while ordinary circulated pieces remain inexpensive. That distinction protects collectors from the exaggerated claims often associated with old coin videos and makes the real story much more interesting. The treasure is not hidden in every 1951 D, but in the exceptional survivors. And now, as the camera focuses tightly on this little Lincoln cent, imagine where it might have traveled during its first years. Perhaps it entered circulation in Denver and moved through a grocery store, a gas station, a factory, or a family business. Perhaps it was carried by someone whose daily life was shaped by the Korean War, rising prices, and the rapidly expanding American economy. Perhaps it sat unnoticed in a cash drawer while President Truman dealt with one of the most difficult foreign policy crises of his presidency. Maybe it was handed to a child as part of an allowance, dropped into a pocket, and eventually saved because someone noticed the date. The coin itself could not know that 1951 was a year of major political conflict, rising inflation, military tension, and a historic change in the relationship between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Yet it physically existed within that world. That is the magic of the 1951 D wheat cent. It is not automatically rare because it is old, and it is not automatically valuable because it has a Denver Mintmark. With a mintage of 625,355,000, the ordinary issue was produced in enormous numbers. But time has separated those hundreds of millions into different levels of survival. Many became worn and ordinary. Millions still exist in some form. Far fewer retain the sharpness and originality necessary for top grades, and only a small number occupy the extreme upper end of the certified population. That is where the potential for serious value begins. If your 1951 D is scratched, heavily worn, or darkly toned, its value may remain modest. If it is an attractive circulated example with strong details and original surfaces, it may deserve a small premium. If it is uncirculated, sharply struck, and beautifully preserved, its value can rise substantially. And if it combines an exceptional grade with original red color, minimal marks, strong eye appeal, or a recognized variety, such as a doubled die, over Mintmark, or repunched Mintmark, it becomes a much more serious numismatic object. The documented $8,100 MS68 RD auction result proves that the very finest 1951 D cents can reach remarkable prices, but it should be remembered as an exceptional auction outcome rather than a typical valuation. Ultimately, the real story of the 1951 D is not simply that one old penny might be worth thousands. The deeper story is that this tiny coin survived from an America caught between war and prosperity, between inflation and economic expansion, and between the old post-war financial system and the new monetary independence established by the 1951 Accord. It was created to perform the most ordinary job imaginable, yet it endured long enough to become a historical witness. More than 70 years later, when you turn it over and see Lincoln on one side and the wheat ears on the other, you are looking at a small piece of the early Cold War era. And if that little D is accompanied by exceptional preservation or a genuine recognized variety, you may be looking at something far more interesting than an old penny. You may be looking at one of the survivors that time, circulation, and chance failed to destroy. Next up to imagine a 1-cent coin leaving the Denver Mint in 1952, at a moment when America was living between the memory of a recently ended World War and the uncertainty of a dangerous new Cold War. The coin before you is the 1952 D Lincoln wheat cent, identified by the small D Mintmark beneath the date. To someone seeing it today, it might look like nothing more than an old copper penny, perhaps brown from age, scratched from circulation, or naturally toned after decades of storage. But the year stamped into this tiny piece of metal places it directly inside one of the most tense periods of 20th century American history. Harry S. Truman was president, the Korean War was still being fought, the Cold War was influencing American foreign policy, and the country was preparing for another presidential election. The Korean conflict had begun in 1950 when North Korean forces invaded South Korea, prompting Truman to commit American forces as part of a United Nations military effort. By 1952, the war had become a grinding conflict with enormous human and financial costs, while negotiations toward an armistice continued without an immediate settlement. At home, Americans were experiencing a mixture of prosperity, anxiety, and economic pressure. The industrial expansion of the 1940s had created a powerful economy, but defense spending connected to Korea was again placing pressure on resources and prices. The United States had also entered the nuclear age, and the rivalry with the Soviet Union had created a permanent sense that another major international crisis could erupt without warning. In this environment, the 1952 D cent served one of the simplest purposes imaginable. It was money for everyday Americans. It was created so people could make purchases, receive change, pay small amounts, and keep ordinary commerce moving. A penny could pass through a grocery store, a factory, a school, a gas station, a farm, or a family home without anyone considering it historically important. Yet that is precisely what makes the coin fascinating today. It was not produced as a commemorative object. It was produced to work. It circulated through a nation dealing with military tension, political uncertainty, rising consumer demand, and rapid social change. Every surviving 1952 D therefore connects us to a particular moment when America was simultaneously enjoying post-war economic strength and confronting the frightening realities of the Cold War. The design of the 1952 D also carries a story that reaches far beyond the year printed on the coin. The Lincoln cent had first appeared in 1909, making Abraham Lincoln the first United States president to appear on a regular circulating United States coin. Victor David Brenner created Lincoln's portrait, while the reverse displayed two wheat ears surrounding the denomination and inscriptions. This wheat ear reverse remained in production until 1958, making the 1952 D part of a long-running design tradition that millions of Americans had already known for more than 4 decades. By 1952, Lincoln cents were deeply woven into everyday American life. Children received them as allowances, merchants counted them in cash drawers, workers carried them in pockets, and families accumulated them in jars and small containers. The technical specifications were equally familiar. The 1952 D measured approximately 19 millimeters in diameter and weighed about 3.11 grams, with a bronze composition of 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc. According to PCGS, the Denver Mint produced 746,130,000 examples in 1952. That enormous mintage is extremely important when discussing rarity because it tells us immediately that the ordinary 1952 D is not a scarce coin simply because of its date. So how many 1952 D wheat cents are actually believed to exist today? And what should someone expect if they discover one? The most defensible current estimate from PCGS is approximately 74 million surviving examples across all grades, with about 10,000 at MS60 or better and approximately 5,000 at MS65 or better. Again, these are survival estimates, not a literal count of every unique coin on Earth. They include raw coins and pieces certified by different grading services, and population data can change as coins are discovered, submitted, resubmitted, or removed from collections. For an ordinary circulated example, the value may be only a few cents to perhaps a few tens of cents, depending on condition and market demand. Better circulated examples with attractive surfaces can bring more, while about uncirculated pieces may reach the dollar range. Uncirculated brown coins can range from several dollars upward depending on grade, while red-brown and especially red examples can command much stronger premiums. In the higher mint state grades, values can move into the tens or hundreds of dollars, and the finest certified pieces can reach thousands. The documented $3,840 MS67 plus RD auction result is the clearest illustration of the top end for the regular issue. The variety market adds another dimension. A recognized 1952 D/S over Mintmark can bring a substantial premium, with a certified MS66 RD example having sold for $650. These results show why there is no single answer to the question, what is a 1952 D penny worth? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on which 1952 D you have. A heavily worn, scratched brown cent is one category. A lightly circulated coin with original surfaces is another. A high-grade red specimen is another. A certified top population example is something else entirely. And a high-grade. And now, as this 1952 D Lincoln wheat cent fills the screen, imagine the first moment it entered American commerce. The Korean War was still being fought. Truman was approaching the end of his presidency. Eisenhower was preparing to campaign for the White House. American families were buying televisions and automobiles, moving into growing suburbs, and experiencing a consumer economy that would help define the decade. At the same time, Cold War tensions were creating fears about communism, nuclear weapons, and the possibility of another global conflict. The coin moved quietly through that world. It did not carry a message announcing the political drama of 1952. It simply carried Lincoln's face and the familiar wheat ears, performing the basic job for which it had been made. Yet every transaction added another chapter to its journey. It may have passed through a store during a time of rising prices, sat in a worker's pocket while news from Korea filled newspapers, or been placed into a child's collection by someone who thought old pennies were worth saving. Eventually, decades of time separated that coin from the America that created it. Today, the ordinary 1952 D remains plentiful enough that collectors should not assume every example is a fortune. With an original mintage of 746,130,000, the date itself is a high production issue. But the finest survivors tell a different story. PCGS estimates only about 5,000 examples at MS65 or better, and the recorded $3,840 result for an MS67 plus RD demonstrates what extraordinary preservation can accomplish in the marketplace. A recognized variety, such as the D/S over Mintmark, can add another layer of interest and value. So if you have a 1952 D, do not judge it simply by its age or by the fact that it is a wheat penny. Look carefully at the surfaces. Check the amount of wear. Examine the color. Look at the mint mark under magnification. Study the lettering and major design elements for legitimate die characteristics. And most importantly, never clean the coin in an attempt to make it appear more valuable. Its original surface is part of its history and potentially part of its value. The 1952 D is ultimately a fascinating reminder that rarity is not always born at the mint. Sometimes rarity develops slowly, as millions of identical coins travel through the world and time gradually eliminates the finest survivors. More than 7 decades after this little cent entered circulation, it still connects us to an America balancing prosperity with uncertainty, peace with military conflict, and ordinary life with the enormous tensions of the Cold War. The coin was made to be spent, but it survived to be studied. And if the example in your hand happens to possess exceptional preservation, original red color, or a genuine recognized variety, that ordinary 1-cent piece may suddenly become something much more extraordinary. A surviving witness to 1952, and potentially one of the more valuable treasures hiding in an old wheat cent collection. Next up to in the imagine holding a 1-cent coin that was struck more than 7 decades ago. A tiny piece of copper that passed through the hands of ordinary Americans during one of the most tense and transformative moments of the 20th century. At first glance, the 1953 D. Lincoln wheat penny may look like nothing more than an old brown coin from another generation, but when you place it in its historical setting, the story becomes much larger than its 1-cent denomination. This coin was produced at the Denver Mint in 1953, a year when the United States was standing at the crossroads between wartime uncertainty and a new post-war America. The country had entered a new presidential era, the Cold War was intensifying, American soldiers were still fighting in Korea, and millions of families were adjusting to an economy that was changing rapidly after years of wartime production. On January 20th, 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower took the oath of office and became the nation's president, replacing Harry S. Truman. Eisenhower was not an ordinary political figure. He had been the celebrated military commander who had helped lead the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, and his election represented a powerful public desire for a different direction after the difficult Truman years. Yet when Eisenhower entered the White House, America was far from peaceful. The Korean War was still being fought. The Soviet Union remained America's principal Cold War rival. Nuclear weapons had transformed the meaning of international conflict, and Americans were living with the constant possibility that another major confrontation could erupt. Eisenhower's inaugural address reflected exactly this atmosphere, describing a world divided between opposing forces and warning of the continuing challenges facing civilization. And somewhere inside that enormous national story, millions of small copper cents were quietly moving through the American economy. The 1953 D-penny was not created as a collector's treasure. It was made because the United States needed enormous quantities of low-denomination coins for everyday commerce. A penny bought small necessities, completed transactions, sat in cash registers, filled household jars, and circulated through stores, banks, vending machines, and pockets across the country. The coin was part of an economic system that depended upon dependable small change, and its humble denomination made it one of the most frequently handled objects in American life. The Denver Mint produced 700,515,000 Lincoln cents dated 1953, making the issue enormous by modern collecting standards. That number is extremely important because it immediately changes the way we should understand the word rare. The ordinary 1953 D-wheat penny is not a rare coin simply because it is old. Hundreds of millions were struck, and millions survived. What can become genuinely scarce are exceptional examples. Coins with superb original surfaces, strong strikes, beautiful original red color, unusual varieties, or significant minting errors. So if you are looking at a 1953 D-penny today, the real question is not merely whether it is old. The real question is what happened to that particular coin during the 70-plus years between its birth at the Denver Mint and the moment it reached your hands. Now comes the question that attracts almost every viewer. What could a 1953 D-wheat penny actually be worth? The answer ranges enormously because condition and variety matter more than the date alone. A heavily circulated example with obverse wear, scratches, dark discoloration, or damage may bring only a modest premium over its face value, often in the range of a few cents to perhaps a small fraction of a dollar, depending on its exact condition and market. Better circulated pieces, especially attractive examples with clear details and original surfaces, can bring more, but they are still not automatically valuable. In lower mint state grades, the coin becomes more interesting to collectors, and especially attractive red examples can command prices in the tens of dollars or more. Once a 1953 D reaches the upper mint state grades, however, the market becomes far more selective. Current market information indicates that MS-67 red examples can bring several $100s, while recognized repunched Mintmark varieties can also command significant premiums depending on grade and certification. Recent auction information has recorded examples of 1953 D/D varieties selling for hundreds of dollars, including an MS-66 red FS. 502 example reported at $252, while a 1953 DMS-67 red NGC example was reported at $336 in a heritage auction. But the most dramatic number comes from the finest known level. PCGS records an auction result of $7,475 for a 1953 D Lincoln cent graded MS-67, sold by Bowers and Marina in August 2007. That figure demonstrates why an ordinary-looking penny can sometimes become a major numismatic prize. The coin itself is still 1 cent in denomination, but the condition is extraordinary. The difference between an ordinary circulated example and an elite mint state specimen is the difference between a coin that spent decades being used and one that somehow escaped the normal destructive path of circulation. PCGS's current condition census identifies MS-67 plus red examples at the top of its listed population for the regular issue, including pieces associated with the right collection. So a reasonable broad market framework is this. Circulated 1953 D cents are generally inexpensive. Attractive uncirculated examples can move into the tens or hundreds of dollars depending on grade and color, Major recognized varieties can command additional premiums, and exceptionally high-grade red specimens can reach into the thousands, with the documented auction record reaching $7,475. These figures should always be treated as market-dependent estimates rather than promises, because auction prices change according to grade, appeal, certification, provenance, demand, and the exact variety involved. And that brings us to the most important lesson hidden inside this little 1953 D wheat penny. If you find one, do not immediately assume that the date and D Mintmark alone make it a fortune. Instead, slow down and study it. Look at Lincoln's portrait and examine the highest points for wear. Study the fields for scratches and cleaning marks. Look at the color of the copper. Is it naturally brown, reddish-brown, or does it retain an unusually bright original red appearance? Turn it over and inspect the wheat ears, the lettering, and the overall sharpness of the strike. Then examine the D Mintmark carefully, because recognized repunched Mintmark varieties exist for this issue, including FS 501 and FS 502. Do not mistake random scratches or damage for a mint error. A genuine variety should match documented characteristics, and valuable errors should be authenticated before anyone makes a dramatic value claim. The same caution applies to cleaning. A shiny penny is not necessarily a valuable penny. Harsh cleaning can remove original surfaces and leave unnatural lines or brightness that actually reduce collector appeal. Originality matters. Preservation matters. Certification matters when the potential value becomes substantial. Most importantly, remember what the coin represents. This 1953 D cent was born in Denver during a year when America was changing presidents, confronting the Cold War, finishing a devastating conflict in Korea, wrestling with inflation, entering a recession, and building the foundations of the consumer society that would define the decade. The coin was never intended to become an antique. It was manufactured as ordinary money, destined to disappear into everyday life. Yet more than 70 years later, surviving examples allow us to hold a physical fragment of that moment. The copper has outlived the cash registers, the stores, the automobiles, the political campaigns, and the people who originally handled it. Some examples became brown and worn. Others retained traces of their original color. A tiny number survived in remarkable condition, and a select group carry unusual minting characteristics that reveal something about how coins were actually produced. That is the real mystery of the 1953 D wheat penny. It was never supposed to be famous. It was supposed to be spent. But every time an unusually preserved example emerges from an old collection, a forgotten box, or a group of inherited coins, it gives collectors another opportunity to look backward into 1953 and see the United States through the smallest possible window. A 1-cent piece can tell the story of industrial America, wartime America, post-war America, and the beginning of the Eisenhower era. And if the example in front of you happens to be one of those rare survivors with exceptional preservation, a recognized repunched mint mark, or extraordinary mint state quality, then the little d beneath the date may be much more than a mint mark. It may be the beginning of a fascinating numismatic discovery. Next up to in the Imagine finding a small copper coin that was struck in Denver during the final year of one of the most recognizable designs in American coinage. A coin that was created when the United States was entering a completely different chapter of its history. The 1958 D. Lincoln wheat penny may look ordinary at first, but its date places it at an extraordinary historical crossroads. This was not simply another year in the long life of the Lincoln cent. It was the final year in which the original wheat reverse appeared on a regular issue Lincoln cent, making 1958 a closing chapter in a design that had served Americans since 1909. By this time, Victor David Brenner's portrait of Abraham Lincoln had been circulating for nearly half a century, while the two wheat ears on the reverse had accompanied generations through economic crises, World War, technological change, and enormous social transformation. The 1958 D cent was struck at the Denver Mint, identified by the D Mintmark beneath the date, and the Denver facility produced an enormous 800,953,300 Lincoln cents, dated 1958. PCGS.com. That huge production figure immediately gives us an important warning. The ordinary 1958 D penny should not automatically be called an ultra-rare coin simply because it is old. In fact, millions of examples survive. What makes particular pieces exciting is their condition, color, originality, varieties, and errors. The historical setting, however, is extraordinary. In 1958, Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and America was living through the Cold War while simultaneously enjoying many of the comforts of post-war prosperity. The country had become a global superpower, but it was also confronting tensions with the Soviet Union, the growing nuclear arms race, political conflicts over civil rights, and a changing economy. The year itself was also economically significant because the United States was experiencing a recession that had begun in 1957 and continued into 1958. Industrial production had weakened, unemployment had increased, and the nation was moving through a period of economic adjustment before growth returned later in the year. Yet ordinary commerce continued, and the humble cent remained essential to everyday transactions. In 1958, D-penny could have passed through a grocery store, a gas station, a movie theater, a diner, a bank, or a child's hands. Nobody using it could have known that the coin represented the final regular year of the wheat reverse. That is what makes this coin so fascinating today. It was ordinary money when it was born, but history eventually transformed it into a collectible artifact. When we move into actual values, the range becomes extremely wide, but it is important to keep expectations realistic. A normal circulated 1958 D wheat penny with moderate or heavy, whereas generally a low-value collectible, often worth only a small amount above face value depending on its exact condition and appearance. A nicer circulated example with attractive color and minimal damage may bring more, but it still does not automatically become a valuable rarity. Once the coin reaches uncirculated condition, the market begins to separate the ordinary from the exceptional. Red, brown, and red designations can make an important difference, and high-grade red examples can reach into the tens or hundreds of dollars depending on grade and eye appeal. At the elite level, the numbers can become dramatically higher. PCGS reports a 1958 D Lincoln Cent graded MS-67 red that sold for $9,600 at a heritage auction in February 2020. PCGS.com. That is an extraordinary result for a coin with a 1-cent denomination, but it illustrates how collectors value condition rather than spending power. The coin did not become valuable because 1 cent suddenly became worth thousands of dollars in everyday commerce. It became valuable because the surviving example possessed exceptional qualities that were extremely difficult to preserve across more than 6 decades. Current PCGS information places the top certified population around the MS-67 level for the red issue, with the finest pieces carrying enormous significance for condition-focused Lincoln Cent collectors. PCGS.com. For a practical value framework, think of heavily circulated pieces as generally inexpensive, attractive circulated and lower uncirculated pieces as modestly collectible, better mint state red examples as potentially worth dozens or hundreds of dollars, and elite MS-67 red specimens as potentially reaching several $1,000s, with the documented auction record at $9,600. These are not guaranteed prices, and a coin's actual market value can change depending on certification, grade, color designation, eye appeal, auction competition, and whether it has a recognized variety or error. That is why it would be misleading to tell viewers that every 1958 D penny is worth thousands. The real treasure is the unusually preserved survivor. If someone finds a 1958 D penny that looks remarkably bright, sharply detailed, and free from obvious damage, that is when the coin deserves a closer examination. But perhaps the greatest reason to care about the 1958 D wheat penny is not the possibility of finding a valuable specimen. It is the fact that this coin represents the final regular chapter of a design that had traveled through nearly 50 years of American history. In 1958, the United States Mint struck the last regular Lincoln cents carrying Brenner's wheat reverse. The following year, the reverse would change to the Lincoln Memorial design, created to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. That means the 1958 D penny is not simply another date in the series. It is the final year issue of an iconic reverse design, and that gives it a special place in American numismatics. Imagine the moment when these coins were being struck in Denver. The people producing them could not have known that collectors decades later would treat 1958 as the end of an era. To the mint employee, it was another production day. To the banker receiving bags of cents, it was another shipment. To a shopkeeper, it was another supply of change. To a child receiving one in a pocket, it was simply a penny. But history has a strange way of turning ordinary objects into witnesses. Today, when you hold a 1958 D wheat cent, you are holding a piece of the final year of the wheat reverse, a survivor from Eisenhower's America, a coin produced during the Cold War, the space race, a recession, and the continuing struggle over civil rights. You are also holding evidence of a remarkable industrial system that produced more than 800 million examples of the same date at the Denver Mint. Most were eventually worn down by circulation. Many were damaged, cleaned, stained, or lost. Others survived in collections, and a much smaller number preserved the qualities that modern collectors prize most. That is why the 1958 D wheat penny deserves to be examined carefully rather than dismissed as just another old cent. Look closely at its color, its surfaces, its strike, and its overall preservation. If you suspect a variety or error, compare it against reliable references and consider professional authentication before believing in extraordinary valuation. And remember the most important point of all. Rarity is not created simply by age. It is created when scarcity meets demand, when exceptional preservation survives against the odds, or when a genuine production anomaly gives a coin an identity shared by very few others. The ordinary 1958 D penny may be common, but the finest survivors tell a very different story. Somewhere between millions of ordinary cents and the handful of exceptional examples lies the reason collectors continue searching. The coin that was once casually spent for 1 cent can, under the right circumstances, become a $5, $50, $500, or even several $1,000 numismatic artifact. And when you look at that tiny D beneath the date, you are not just seeing where the coin was made. You are seeing the signature of Denver on the final regular Lincoln wheat cent of an era that would never return.